Hi everybody. So I hope you. So this is the first time for me for live streaming. I hope I don't know if I'm all alone or not. So today I wanted to talk about ethical and privacy challenge in the area of personal service and big data. So I hope you all see the screen and the slide. I'm Sébastien Gambs. I'm a professor in computer science at UQAM and currently hold the Canada researcher in privacy preserving and ethical analysis of big data. So first, I would like to thank the organizer for letting me the opportunity to speak at SecRev. So what I would like to talk today is related to cybersecurity. So for me, privacy is a part of cybersecurity. I would like to present to you some of what I think will be the challenge related to privacy and also to ethics issue related to personalized service and big data. So first, just to give a brief introduction. So I just hope you all see the screen. I know it's I'm not as well organized as other streams, so I apologize for this. So one thing I would like to mention is, as you know, in our daily life, in our information society, we have get used to personalization. So the fact that we have recommendation system and algorithm that personalize the prediction and the recommendations that they do according to our profile and the data that they capture about us. So for instance, if you go on Facebook, you will get recommended some friends based on your taste and also on other friends that you have. If you do a search on Google, then the result of the query that you get is based also on your history of past queries. And if you go on Netflix, you will get recommended movies that are similar to what other people like and that are supposed to be according to your taste. So these algorithms are becoming more and more, I would say, pervasive in our life. And there is, of course, a necessity to really understand what are the biases that this algorithm could have and what is their impact on society. So one of the issues I would like to discuss today later would be how to, for instance, to quantify and measure and prevent possible discrimination of this algorithm against some groups in the population. So one example of algorithms that will be used in the future and that will replace human, it's, for instance, to do predictive recruiting. So I apologize the slide in France, but really the idea is that currently today when you apply for a job, a human will look at your curriculum vitae. And so predictive recruiting is trying to automatize this by having a machine actually using some learning algorithm, trying to extract the information of your CV and really to predict whether or not you are a good candidate for a particular job. So one of the promises that the companies that do this type of service put as an advantage is that the recruitment process will become more objective because it will be a machine, so it will not have all the stereotype and the bias that a human could have. But of course, if you train an algorithm with data that was biased, the algorithm could be biased also as well. Another example where you also need to understand or some issue of discrimination could occur is, for instance, when you train a chatbot. So chatbot is basically an artificial intelligence system that is trying to dialogue, to converse with a human. And for instance, Microsoft had a Twitter bot called Tay, and this Twitter bot was not only responding to human, but it was also learning from interaction, from discussion with human. So of course, one of the big issues that we have in this case is what if the chatbot is becoming racist and sexist, for instance, with Tay, is what happened simply because he's capturing what other people are trying to say. So of course, in this case, it will also have a bias that we also need to understand. And so really what has changed in the last decade, I would say, is what people refer as big data. So big data, usually the definition that you will get is a kind of technical one where there is the notion of 5V. So the data comes in volume. The data is very diverse, so there is a lot of variety. There is also a notion of velocity. So the data is not only static, is coming at a high frequency. So for instance, if you think about Internet of Things where you have sensors in your homes, this is not only the data that you get in 1 hour, but of course the data will be captured in a frequent basis. And also the notion of variability of the data, so it can change over time, and veracity. So this would be, I would say, the technical definition, but really what it refers is as the fact that the quantity of data and the diversity as data has really changed in the last decade. And I would say the main premises for society of big data is to have the possibility to realize inference with a level of accuracy and details that was not possible before. So if you think about machine learning, the fact that the quantity of data is much bigger means that the inference that you can do can be much more fine-grained and much more precise. And of course, one thing which is important to remember about big data is actually most of what people call big data is what I would call big personal data. So most of the data that is generated is not only about signals coming from the stars, for instance, which has been picked up by an observatory on Earth, but most of the data is actually collected by a user or even generated by a user. So for instance, if you look at this slide, I just hope you see it. It shows that on every minute on one day, for instance, there is 4 million people making a query on Google. So this is the number of queries that is generated. You have also more than 2.5 pieces of content that are shared on Facebook. So this is data that is also generated by user. And of course, you have also a lot of tweets, a lot of interest, a lot of videos that are shared on YouTube. And the good premises, I would say, the good thing with big data is you can try to use it, for instance, to do personalized medicine. So the fact that we will be able to create tailored treatment for cancer. So this is, for instance, one product of IBM called Watson, which is a kind of advisor for cancer. And the idea is this advisor could be used by a doctor or in cooperation with a doctor to try to give to a patient a particular treatment that is more specialized and more personalized than just the broad treatment of the population. And then this treatment will really be useful for this particular patient, while if you give the same treatment to all patients without taking, for instance, into account their DNA or their, I would say, their environment or their contextual information, then the effect that you can get might be good on average, but for some people it might be bad, and for some people it might not be useful at all. Another good thing you can do with big data and the fact that you have a lot of data is large-scale mobility analytics. So this is the idea that because user generates a lot of mobility data. So one example I give on this slide is a challenge which was put forward by Orange called the Data for Development Challenge. So in this context, the idea is that when you are a phone user, basically you generate a lot of mobility data, because each time you make a phone call or you receive an SMS, there will be a line in the database called the call detail records, which will record the place where this, I mean, the base station where you have done this call. And the idea of the D4D challenge was to open this data to different research groups to be able to do some study on the data. So for instance, some people were able to build some model for predicting the spread of disease due to the analysis of the mobility. Of course, if you work for the city, you might be interested to do some urban planning based on the data. And so in this context, if you look at the outcome of this challenge, it's very easy to see that there is a lot of good analysis, interesting and useful analysis that can be done of the data, but really one of the fundamental question and how this data can be anonymized before publishing it to limit the privacy risk of users. So what we want to do is to be able to extract some global knowledge that could benefit to society. But of course, if I am able to find your mobility data in this data set, it means I can also find important information about yourself. And this is just a few examples of data that have a strong inference potential. So mobility data is one of them. Another one is genomic and medical data. So for instance, if you give me your DNA, so if, for instance, if you have used a service such as 23andMe, which propose to really analyze your DNA for less than $100, you have to be careful, because if this data leaks, the risk of privacy could be used, for instance, to predict some risks that you have of genetic disease or tendency to develop some health problems. So if I am an insurance company, I might be interested to find out if some user have their DNA in open data sets, for instance, to use it to really tailor the price to the genomic data of a particular user. And of course, DNA can also be used for discrimination, so it will reveal the ethnic origin, and the fact that you, for instance, choose to reveal your DNA has not only an effect on your privacy, but also on the privacy of your relatives. So for instance, if I reveal my genome, it's not a question of only my personal choice, but of course, it will also reveal something about the DNA of my parents or my children. And so this is one example of data with strong inference potential. Another example of data is data from social networks. So if you have a Facebook account, and even if this account is private, the fact that somebody knows some social links that you have with other people, and the fact that these other people might have given some information on their profile about, for instance, their religion, their leisure, their hobbies, their work, make it possible to use the structure of the graph to also perform inference on your own profile. So for instance, some people have shown that just by knowing the structure of the graph and knowing some social connection between a user and other user, it's possible to predict, for instance, their political opinion with a good accuracy, their religion or their sexual orientation and hobby. And this comes from the fact that usually the friends, the so-called friends that we have on Facebook are usually people that share some characteristics. So usually your contact on Facebook might be some people from the same school as you, from the same university, or for the same place of work. And so all this risk, I would try to describe now 3 factors that have increased the risk in terms of privacy. So the first factor is the fact that it's becoming more and more easy to record and to have personal data captured and taken by objects that we have on our daily life. So for instance, if 10 years ago it was, somebody that want to take a picture of you needed special camera, for instance, now it's very easy with, so Google Glass have backup, but you have, for instance, some companies that make some glass for sport that also integrate a video camera. So it's become very easy as you run, for instance, to capture what other people do around you. Of course, with Quantify Self and all the apparatus like Fitbit that record our health data, it's also become very easy to capture all the health information automatically. And the fact that also in the future we'll have smart meter in our house means that it will be also easier and easier to capture data about your electrical consumption in the home, which can also be translated into inference about how many people live in the same home and what activities they are doing. Another factor is the open data movement. So big data is also fed by the fact that there is more and more tendency to open data, which at first, so if you go back 5 or 10 years ago, the data that were open usually were not really sensible in terms of privacy because it might be some public information. So if I take an example of a city that is opening the data of the city, at first what will be open will be, for instance, the position of the bus station, the position of the bike lane, the schedule of trains. But you see that in the last 5 years, I would say there was more and more pressure also to open data that is personal data and that relate to an individual. So in this slide, I don't know if you see it, but the example that I put forward is open data that was done in United Kingdom, where the data of children from school was open. So there was more than 400 attributes describing coming from the academic data related to children. And this data was open for a hackathon where people were invited to analyze and build apps. But of course, when the data is out, it's too late. So it might be possible, for instance, before, if I am a company and I am asking myself if I should hire somebody, I could try to find out if he's in this open data and try to use this information for which increase the privacy risk is so in Montreal. So Montreal has now become one of the main places on Earth for artificial intelligence, and one of the reasons for that is that in the last, I would say in the last 15 years or in the last decade, there was also tremendous progress in terms of learning algorithms. So now it's possible to train what we call deep networks, which can, for instance, do some tasks such as generating a textual description automatically just from picture, or even competing against professional Go player using advanced learning techniques such as deep neural networks. And so this leads to the possibility of doing automatically some tasks that were impossible to do or very difficult to do 15 years ago due to the algorithmic advance in machine learning, and also due to the fact that the computation power has increased and the amount of data available has also increased. So of course, when you look at all these aspects, you need also to balance this with the privacy right of people. So just to remember that privacy is a fundamental right, like the right to freedom of expression, or the right of freedom of choosing the religion. So this right is protected by several declarations and regulations. So one is, for instance, the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights at the Assembly of United Nations. But if you have a look into your email account in the last day, I'm sure you have noticed that a lot of companies have sent you information asking whether you consent to stay with this company because they have updated their privacy policy and their privacy practice following regulation of Europe, which is often called as the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. So this regulation has become effective last week, on the 25th of May. And this regulation gives also new rights to privacy to users. I will come back to this a bit in the presentation. So really the risk is that we want to avoid that an unlawful and unauthorized entity is collecting more and more of your digital trace and personal data for fraudulent purposes. So for instance, if I am a company and I can collect some of your data to do a profile as well as your email address, I might try to do some targeted spam. Which is annoying on its own, but it can go a bit further. So for instance, it can go up to identity theft. So the fact that somebody can steal the identity of a particular person. For instance, if I call your bank and they ask me some information about your birthday or the maiden name of your mother, then if somebody is able to capture this information because it's available online, then it could take your identity, do a loan on your name, and then you will have to prove to the bank that you did not do this action, but it might already be too late. And as we will see, there is also risk of unfair discrimination, as we will discuss later. So really, what is the impact of big data on privacy? So privacy risks are not new per se. There has been a lot of work in the privacy security community for at least 20 or 25 years, but the fact that big data is coming, so the fact that we have more and more data about user and more diverse data, means that the risks that existed before will also increase due to the diversity and volume of the data available. And also, one of the notions that exists in the privacy regulation for protecting people is the notion of consent. So usually, when a company or asks about your data for a particular service, they will ask for your consent in order to collect this data for this particular objective. So really, normally a company should not, once it has collected your data, use it for a different purpose unless you have given your consent. But of course, if you think about the objective of big data, so big data is really about trying to connect a lot of different data sources to do new analysis that we might not even be aware when we first collect the data from a user. So what does it mean for a user to consent for their data to be used for big data? So what does it mean for them to consent for the data to be used for a lot of different analysis and a lot of different cross-referencing with different data sets without even knowing about this type of analysis in advance? So the notion of consent, I would say, is in difficulty with a notion of big data. The third, I would say, impact of big data on privacy in the fact that the inference that you can do is much more fine-grained than before and much more precise. So the risk that exists before, they are, I would say, increased, or now it's even possible to predict things because of the amount of data that we could not do before. And one thing also that we really need to be careful about is that once the data is out, it's impossible to come back and to erase the data. So also there is a kind of a right to be forgotten or a right to erasure in the GDPR. In practice, such a right does not exist, in the sense that once you have made available publicly a copy of a particular data set, then it's already too late, and there is no magical button that you can use to reveal all the copies that have been done and that are disseminated all over the web. And 5, in fact, would be what I would call the ethics of inference. So because we can do new inference does not mean that we should do all of them. So there is a question about what are really the inference that the society, that are acceptable for society and which one are not. So to give you a concrete example, one type of service that has appeared in the last year is predictive policing. So the idea is that you could use data that you have as a police unit, which come from your data set from that you have about the community or about people that have some criminal record, but also data that come from their activity online, to try to predict what are the possible people that are likely to commit a crime in the future. So if you have already seen or read Minority Reports, it's a bit like trying to use the possibility to tag people as possible future criminal to basically, so what happened in Chicago is that the police was using this kind of learning technique to try to find out future criminal, and they were really knocking at the door of people that had not yet commit a crime or that did commit a crime in the past, but that have done their time in jail, to tell them that they are currently in the hit list of the city, and that if there is a crime in the neighborhood, the police might consider them as suspect. So this is really trying to put the pressure on people that have not yet done something, because the algorithm has predicted that they might be that might commit a new crime in the future. So this was my introduction. So the 2 things I would like to discuss for the rest of my presentation is really transparency, accountability, and fairness. So this really relates to new ethical challenges that come from the development of artificial intelligence and big data. And then at the end, if time permits, I would like to also discuss about the new challenge in terms of privacy. So one thing I would like to say first is that the border between personalization and discrimination is not easy to draw. So for instance, you might be happy if you go online on a website and you receive a price, for instance, so if you buy an airplane ticket and if the website told you that the price is you have a 20% discount on the price. So this is price personalization, and a lot of people would be happy for a lot of service to have some kind of discounts or that the price is personalized for them. But of course, there is also the issue of discrimination. So for instance, if some attributes are used, such as your sex or your ethnic origin, to discriminate or to personalize the price, this is really an issue with discrimination. So for instance, one study has shown that if you go on the Teppel's website, really depending on the location where you are, you will get a price that is based, or that depends on the county where you live. So I don't want to go into detail, but basically if you live in a county where there is also Staples shop, or if there is a competitor shop so physical store in your neighborhood, then you will get a lower price on Staple, because the rationale is that if there is a physical shop that has a low price, the user might be tempted to go to this shop. But if the price is personalized and very low, then the user will be tempted to buy online. So in this case, the location is used for personalization, which might be good. But if you think in some country like USA, where the zip code, so the localization is very correlated with the ethnic origin, the fact that we already use the location might raise some question about the risk of discrimination targeted towards some group in the population. And of course, if this algorithm which personalizes the result that you get is used for credits, for insurance rates, or for predictive recruiting or access to school, then this could have really a big impact on people. So in the GDPR, for instance, so the new regulation, you see that there is some new rights that appear in this regulation. So I don't want to read it, but basically there is an article in GDPR that says that a user has a right to have a fair and transparent processing of his data. So this means, and the legislation says that the controller should use all the mathematical and statistical procedure to ensure that the decision that is taken by the algorithm minimize the risk and prevent all the effects that can discriminate based, for instance, on racial, ethnic origin, political opinion, religion, trade union, genetic or health status, etc. So you see that already there is, in this new regulation, a new right for people to ensure that the processing that are done by an algorithm is fair by design. But of course, one difficulty with fairness is that if you ask different people, they might come with different definition of fairness. So so just to give two concrete examples, one possible definition of fairness is what people call individual fairness. So this is the idea if you have two individuals, for instance, which apply for a job and their profile are similar, except for the sensitive or protected attributes such as the sex, then the decisions should be the same. So for instance, if a man and a woman apply, they have exactly the same curriculum vitae, then the chance of getting a job should be the same independently of their gender. So this seems to be this is to make sense, but another definition which also makes sense is group fairness. So which might be to look at different statistics about groups. So if you take the group, for instance, of men and the group of women that are accepted at a particular job or at a particular school, basically what you would like is that the recruitment algorithms that look at the data and produce a binary decision which is accepted or refused should really accept or refuse the same proportion of male and female. So really, in this case, what you would like is that for the group of men and women, the proportion of acceptance and of refusal should be the same. But it's very easy that these two notions of fairness, it's possible to build some scenario where you can show that these two metrics are not compatible. So just to give an example, so imagine that the school is using a kind of algorithm to decide whether a student should be allowed or not to go inside the school. So you have a school that is very popular. There is too many demand and not enough space for accommodating all the students. So imagine that the school wants to base the process of letting somebody in the school based on the average of ratings that it had, which really makes sense. And imagine that we live in a society where, in average, women have a rating or a score that is higher than men. So if you consider two scenarios, so the first one, you imagine that you just use the average of rating of potential student to decide whether or not if he is accepted. If you look at the rating, have the same rating, they will have the same decisions. But because women have on average more, the rating are better, it means that in this case, on average, women will get accepted more often than men. And so in this case, we will have individual fairness because we only look at the rating. But we will not have group fairness because the proportion of women that will get accepted will be higher than the proportion of men because naturally their rating or their average rating is higher. In the scenario 2, where you imagine that the school wants to reach a kind of group fairness, so the school is willing to change a bit its procedure to ensure that the ratio of men and women are accepted as the same. One way to do this would be to have some kind of mechanical or artificial mechanism that increase a little bit the average rating of all the men that apply to the school. So in this case, you could, by doing some kind of artificial mechanism, ensure that there will be a group fairness, so there will be the same proportion of men and women overall accepted. But of course, you lose the group because you have a mechanism that changes the average rating of men And this means that if you have a man and a woman which apply with the same rating at the beginning, because of the artificial mechanism, the ratings that the man will receive at the end will be a bit higher, and then you will have lose individual fairness. So this is just an example of really a basic scenario where you can show that these two mechanisms are incompatible to each other. So of course, when you look at the bias in the data, so really often people have a tendency to criticize and to put algorithm, but usually the learning algorithm are what they are doing is just they are capturing what is happening on the data. So usually the bias that the algorithm, that personalized decision could have is generally coming from the data. So for instance, it can happen that in the data that was collected, there might be some errors. So for instance, if you collect data by asking a user in a survey about some of the characteristics, so some people might lie or might do some mistakes when they respond to the data, or simply the data can be the bias, sorry, can be a societal bias. So if it happens that for 30 years in the population, the salary of women were less than the salary of men because of a kind of societal bias, of course, if you feed the algorithm with these data sets, it will only capture the bias in the data. And also, often, even if a learning algorithm is very good and even if it has the 99% accuracy, a wrong decision, is it because they have some kind of special characteristic, or what would be the way for them to have some recourse against this decision? So one subject of research that has been very active in the last year is trying to fight against what some people have called the opacity of learning algorithm. So in most of the personalized system learning algorithm have a central, and as I was talking about deep neural networks, they have been very good at prediction. So as they have been very good at capturing what is in the data and making accurate prediction. But if you look at the deep neural network, which is basically a neural network with a lot of layers, so it might go up to 20 or even more, then what was lost in the process is really the understanding and the explanation about their decision. So due to their complex design, it's very difficult to understand why a particular deep neural network has made this decision. So of course, you can follow the neurons that were activated and you can have access to the structure, but for a human, it's very difficult to make sense of the structure of the networks and really to understand the rationale of the decision. And some philosophers like Antoinette Rouvois have even warned, I would say, the society against what they call the risk of algorithmic dictatorship. So it's a risk that one day, maybe in 10, 15, 5 or 20 years, we will live in a society where a lot of algorithms will take automatic decision about ourselves, but without giving some explanation about their decision. So for instance, when you will send your kid to a school, the algorithm will say yes or no, but it will not give any information about what was wrong in the profile of your kid, what could have been done to change this decision. And so transparency, I would say, is really a first step toward increasing or trying to add more fairness, I would say, in the decision. So today, we really live in a system where usually I would say the machine or the companies that collect the data know a lot more about us than we know about how the algorithm really function. So because of all the data that is gathered and captured, it's possible now even to make some prediction. So for instance, if a woman is becoming pregnant, it might be the case that a learning algorithm could predict it from the data generated by the Fitbit and for in the food or the change in the mood, even before that the woman is pregnant. So the system knows a lot about us and we don't know. So I would say transparency is the first step. And really, if we live in a, so Frank Pascalet call it the black box society. So if we live in a society where we don't have any idea about how learning algorithm or algorithms that take decisions that impact us work, this will also lead to a lack of trust. So why should we trust a system where we have no idea about the rationale behind algorithms? So I would say transparency is the first step towards improving the situation. And you will see that there was a lot of work done at different levels. So for instance, one way to address transparency is to have some regulatory approach where you force company to open their source code or to let user examine and correct the information that is collected about them. So one way could say that. So one example could be that if you are a government and you make a call for a company to build a particular system. So for instance, think about. So I could take the example about the Phoenix system that is used for the payment of salary in the government. So one thing that the government could have done is to ask that for all decision or for all choice or personalization that is done by the algorithm, the explanation or the rationale behind the decisions to be open. So one way to do this is by regulation. But of course, another way to do this is by opening the black box by having some transparency approach by design. So for instance, some people have shown that even if I don't send some data to the system, so if I'm able to create some profile and receive the result of the decision of the personalization, then it's possible from just this example of input-output to build some interpretable models that could be used to have some explanation about the rationale of the decision. And of course, if you have the source code, you can also try to analyze it by automatical tool. So this is also a way to approach privacy, transparency. And you see that there is really in community effort in the last years to really build, I would say, a community of experts that address transparency. So there is one initiative, just to name one, which is called the Data Transparency Lab, which is a community of technologists, but also policymaker and representative for industry, that works on a way to try to have some transparency by design in the new service that will be created. And once you have transparency, so that I would say transparency is only a first step. After you have transparency, really what is the next step is to try to have some quantitative measure about discrimination. So for instance, if you have a decision that is taken by an algorithm based on a profile, then some people have tried to measure what they call the quantitative input influence. So really the idea is to understand which of the attributes of the profile has a big impact on the decisions that are taken. So the question would be, if you change this particular attribute, then it's likely that the decision will change because this attribute are particular high influence on the decision. So for instance, if you look, I don't know if you see well my my screen, but if you look at the example on the background, you will see that in this case, you have a transparency report which shows that among all the attributes of Mr. Z profile, really the race, the birth year, and the gender were the three which were the most influential in the decision. So in this case, you can really see that these attributes are really correlated to the decision. And you might then question the algorithm whether it's good that the race is has a so high coefficient in the decision. So this is to measure direct discrimination, but of course the difficulty is indirect discrimination. So even if you say I should simply remove the attributes that can lead to discrimination, such as race and gender, from the data to make a decision, there is always a possibility of having also indirect discrimination. So for instance, if you remove the race, but if you live in a country where the zip code is very correlated with the race, if you have removed this attribute, this is not enough. You have to do something else. So you might have to modify the data, for instance, to ensure that the correlation that remain between the sensitive attribute and the rest of the attribute also decrease. And so, as I was saying, another example is to use an interpretable model. So people have shown, for instance, that you can take any classifier in a black box manner. So you can take a deep neural network, for instance, and even if you are not able to understand the structure of the network, you could build some model such as a supersparse linear integer model, which will explain in a way that are understandable by a human, what are really the attributes that have a high decision or have a high correlation in the decision. So what this model does, for instance, is take this complex attribute and it build a table where you have a question about 5 attributes. So this is a data set that is used in USA to predict whether or not somebody has a risk of recidivism if you let it out of jail. And so this complex algorithm was approximated by an interpreter algorithm where you can see that so the first attribute is whether the number of prior arrests is bigger than 5. And then it's about the age of confinement, whether there was prior arrest for property. So, and at the end, you to recidivant. And in this way, you have something that instead of taking 42 binary attributes from the original profile is able to produce a model that has a quite good accuracy. So it's not taking the same decision as the original model always, but it might be able to approximate it with like 95%. But instead of having a question on 42 attributes, you have a question on 5 attributes, and still the precision is good. And of course, really, what we would like is to go toward what we call algorithmic accountability. So once we have been able to have more transparency in system, once we have been able also to capture and measure bias, what we want to ensure is that also we can ensure that really the systems that we put out there, the algorithm that have an impact on people, really respect some ethical value. Could be, if you want, for instance, to control discrimination, but it could be some other ethical value and what some people call the notion of loyalty. So loyalty is really the system really behaving as its promises. So if you have a service that promises not to discriminate and not to use a particular type of data in order to personalize, can you ensure that this system is really loyal to the promise that was done? So this really, I would say, the long-term objective. So transparency is the first step, but even if the source code of an application is public, it might be too complex to comprehend by a human to be understandable. What we want to ensure is algorithmic accountability at the end. And one thing I would like to say, maybe to finish, because it's in a few minutes. So there are some. So one difficulty is that there is a lot of notion of different fairness metrics. So I will not have time to really describe them, but in the research community right now, there is no consensus about the good definition of fairness. So for instance, one way to define fairness could be by selection leaf, where you measure the difference of ratio from one population. So for instance, from the male population that are accepted and the ratio of the female population that are accepted. So basically, if this ratio, the bigger it gets, the more unfair the treatment is. But there is other way to also measure unfairness, and currently there is no consensus to really measure whether a system is fair or not. One other difficulty is that when you look for discrimination, for instance, the way you split your population into subgroups can lead to an observation or not about discrimination. So for instance, if you see my screen, if you look at a population which has 3 ethnic groups, which is a Black, so Afro-American, Caucasian one, and Hispanic, and if you look at the ratio of the number of people that are higher or not for a particular job, if you look directly at this level with a true group, you can see that on this example, white people are usually have usually much more chance to be accepted at this particular job than Afro-American and Hispanic. But if you choose to put together the white and Hispanic category into a category which is non-white, you will see that in this case, you will have the impression that the proportion of Afro-American people that are higher is actually close to the proportion of the rest of the population, which is also 50%. So this relates to a statistical paradox, which is called the Simpson paradox, which means that when you look into particular subgroup in the population and you observe some statistical phenomena, so for instance, some discrimination, then you can observe that sometimes the phenomenon disappear or can even be reversed. So in order to really measure discrimination, you need to be careful and to look for all possible angles. And really the final objective, I would say, of the community for the next year is to be able to increase fairness in the system, but while at the same time not impacting too much accuracy. So for instance, one way to increase the fairness of a particular system is to, for instance, take the data and to sample it in a way to ensure that the original bias is not as frequent. So one way is take the data, try to find a way, for instance, to add more diversity such that a particular group is not overrepresented in the data. So this is one possible way. Another possible way is to really design the personalization of the learning algorithm to be discrimination aware by design. And another way, finally, is you could even take the output of the algorithm. So you could take a classifier, a deep neural network, and change some of the weight of the algorithm or change the structure of the algorithm to reduce discrimination. So this is really, I wanted to talk about it today because it's really important and still it's a very new research topic where much remains to be done. And as I was saying, one of the difficulties is there are several ways to define fairness. And sometimes you could even say that if you want to reach fairness, one way to reach fairness would be for each candidate, you might just flip a random coin to decide whether it's accepted or not with some probability of acceptance that you choose. So in this case, of course, you could have a perfect fairness, but you will have no utility in the sense that the algorithm is not looking at the data at all. So because of the time, I will go to the conclusion. So I didn't have time to talk about the privacy issue, but really the observation that I wanted to make is that first, we live in a society where it's more and more easier to record and store personal data about user. So the number and the amount of data has really increased. And the fact that we have more and more data, so the so-called big data, means that we also have the opportunity to do new inference and to do inference with an accuracy which is higher. And also the fact that the open data movement, the fact that we have the pressure to open in the last year more and more data sets that concern individual means that the amount of data will also increase a lot. And of course, this also increases the privacy risk of big data. So I really would like to say that really the challenge is to be able to balance all the social and economical benefits that we have of big data and still ensure that individuals remain in protection of their privacy and their fundamental rights. And so there is really a strong need for research and scientific cooperation. So I'm sure that one of the objectives of this event is also to ensure that there is new cooperation, new scientific cooperation in terms of big data. So for instance, there is still a lot of research to be done to determine how to address privacy in the context of big data. For instance, as I was saying, the notion of consent is very difficult to ensure in this context. We also have the need for a new way to protect and sanitize data. So I apologize, I didn't have time to go through the privacy part, but really, in this part, I wanted to put forward that before you open data, for instance, it's very important to ensure that the data is properly anonymized. So there is a need to ensure that for each type of data that is released, the risk for privacy inference are really understood, and we build mechanisms to sanitize the data to limit them. So for evaluating the risk, we need to also use big data and use learning algorithm to really be able to understand the inference attack. So the inference that can be done for a particular type of data. So it could happen, for instance, that a particular type of data is okay to be released because the inference potential is not high. But if you think about mobility data, genomic data, or social data, in this case, this data really need to be sanitized in the proper way before it is released because of the privacy risk. And of course, as I was speaking during my talk, there is also this new branch of transparency, fairness, and accountability. So some people would call them FAT, fairness, accountability, transparency issue in a personalized system. And once again, the objective is really to be able to reap all the benefit of big data while making sure that the privacy of individuals, but also their digital life remain controlled. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. So it's almost time to hand over to the next stream. I don't know if people have any question related to the talk. So if not, I thank you, and really I apologize. I know it's much more artisanal than other presentation. I hope you were able to grasp some of the ideas that I was discussing. And I thank you a lot if you have watched my stream. I will stay online for a few minutes in case of people having questions. And please, if you want to watch at the next stream, look online on the website of the event.